In the shadowed lore of the American South, where humidity clings to the truth like moss to an ancient oak, some tales are too grim for the history books. They are whispered in the bayous, carried on the thick, sweet air of the magnolia groves, and buried in the unmarked graves of the forgotten. This is one such account, a story of vengeance simmered in a pot of deepest black, from a time when justice was a luxury and survival a bitter meal. Before the grand plantations became picturesque ruins, they were theaters of profound cruelty, and in one such house, in a kitchen filled with smoke and sorrow, a plot was being served that would curdle the blood of an entire parish. If you find yourself drawn to the echoes of these silenced histories, and this is your first time in our archives, consider subscribing to ensure that no story, no matter how unsettling, is ever truly lost to time. The year was 1831, a time when the world felt both ancient and violently new. Along the serpentine bends of the Red River in Louisiana, the air was a physical entity, a thick, wet blanket woven from heat and the ceaseless drone of insects. It was a landscape of stark, almost biblical contrasts. Cypress trees, draped in funereal shawls of Spanish moss, rose from the stagnant, black water of the swamps, their gnarled roots clawing at the muddy earth like the hands of drowned men. The sun, a merciless white disk in a bleached-out sky, beat down upon the land with a ferocity that seemed personal, baking the clay soil into a network of cracked veins and wilting the broad, green leaves of the cotton plants that stretched for miles in every direction. This was the domain of Master Augustin Duval, a kingdom built on sugarcane, cotton, and the unyielding labor of the enslaved. The Duval plantation was a monument to his ambition, a sprawling enterprise carved directly from the unforgiving wilderness. Its fields were vast, its sugar mill a titan of timber and iron, and its great house a stark white jewel set against the oppressive green of the swamp. The house itself stood on a gentle rise, a two-story structure of whitewashed brick and soaring columns designed to catch whatever fleeting breeze might stir from the river. It was a picture of Gentile order, of Southern grace, its verandas offering shaded respite from the afternoon glare, its windows reflecting the endless sky. But this facade of tranquility was a carefully constructed fiction. The true heart of the plantation, the engine that drove its rhythms of production and consumption, was located at the rear of the main building, connected by a covered walkway. It was the kitchen, a structure almost as large as a small house, built of darker, soot-stained brick, its chimney a constant, silent testament to the appetites it served. Here, the oppressive heat of the Louisiana summer was amplified tenfold, a suffocating, almost liquid environment where the air was thick with smoke, steam, and the complex aromas of cooking. This was the world of Mariah. From before the first hint of dawn until long after the last candle was extinguished in the great house, Mariah's existence was defined by the 4 brick walls of the kitchen. She was the plantation's cook, a position that afforded her a proximity to power that was both a privilege and a profound danger. The kitchen was her domain, but it was also her prison. Its cavernous fireplace, large enough to roast a whole hog, was a ravenous mouth that had to be fed constantly. The floor, made of wide, rough-hewn planks, was permanently darkened with grease and grime, worn into shallow gullies in the most trafficked areas, a map of her endless, circular labor. Rafters high overhead were barely visible through a permanent haze of smoke, and from them hung bundles of dried herbs, smoked meats, and strings of peppers, their shapes rendered ghostly and indistinct in the gloom. The air itself was a stew of smells, the sharp tang of onions, the deep, earthy scent of simmering beans, the sweetness of baking bread, and always, underneath it all, the pervasive, acrid smell of wood smoke and human sweat. Her tools were an extension of her own body, worn smooth by years of use. Heavy cast-iron pots, blackened by 1,000 fires, sat on trivets in the hearth. A collection of knives, their blades sharpened down to thin, elegant slivers, lay in a neat row on a butcher's block the size of a small table. Their wooden handles were stained dark, polished by the grip of her hand, and in the dim, shifting light of the fire, they resembled a surgeon's instruments, or perhaps a row of carefully maintained weapons. Copper pans, the pride of the mistress, hung from hooks on the wall, their polished surfaces reflecting a distorted, warped image of the kitchen and the woman who moved within it. Mariah kept them gleaming, a small act of defiance, a way of imposing a sliver of order onto the chaos of her servitude. It was a detail few noticed, but for her, it was a necessary ritual. She moved through this space with an economy of motion born of decades of practice. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation in her actions. The flick of her wrist as she chopped vegetables was a blur of controlled energy, the sound a rapid, rhythmic drumming that was one of the kitchen's constant refrains. She could judge the temperature of the oven with a hand held near its iron door, could measure ingredients by the weight of them in her palm, could read the state of a simmering sauce by the size and pattern of its bubbles. Mariah was known throughout the parish for her skill. Her bisques were silken, her roasted fowl was impossibly succulent, and her breads were so light and airy they seemed to defy the oppressive humidity that sought to weigh everything down. Her greatest triumph, however, was her gumbo. It was a dish that represented the soul of the region, a complex, mysterious concoction of shellfish, sausage, and okra, thickened with a roux she cooked to a shade of brown, so dark it was nearly black. The aroma alone was enough to draw people from the fields, a rich, smoky perfume that promised a fleeting moment of respite and satisfaction. The planters who dined at Master Augustine's table would praise his hospitality, but they would speak with a special reverence for his cook's gumbo. They spoke of it as a thing of magic, a perfect distillation of the land's bounty. What they did not understand, what they could never comprehend, was that the flawless perfection of her cooking was a mask. Every perfectly seasoned dish, every impeccably baked cake, was a performance of compliance. The satisfaction she provided was a shield, a way to navigate the treacherous currents of the household. The rich, savory depths of her gumbo concealed a bitterness that had been simmering for years, a resentment as dark and patient as her roux. Master Augustine Duval was a man of enormous appetites. He was large in stature, with a booming voice that carried across the yard, and he viewed his plantation as an extension of his own will. He demanded the best of everything, the finest horses, the most productive fields, and a table that groaned under the weight of his cook's creations. He rarely entered the kitchen himself, preferring to experience it through the plates that arrived at his dining table. He knew Mariah only as the source of his culinary pleasure, a pair of skilled hands that existed to satisfy his whims. He was not a man given to introspection. The complex humanity of the people he enslaved was a concept as foreign and uninteresting to him as the dark side of the moon. His world was one of command and consumption, and he saw no contradiction in the fact that the very person who prepared his food with such artistry was his property, a being he could sell or brutalize as he saw fit. A more immediate and palpable threat was the overseer, Silas Crane. He was the enforcer of Master Augustine's will, a thin, wiry man with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Unlike the master, Silas was a constant presence. His heavy boots were often heard on the path outside the kitchen, a sound that would cause a subtle stiffening in Mariah's posture. He was the specter at every feast, the embodiment of the violence that underpinned the plantation's placid facade. He saw any act of kindness, any deviation from the brutal calculus of servitude, as a threat to the natural order. His authority was absolute, his methods cruel, and his attention was a thing to be avoided at all costs. Maria understood that while Master Augustine held the power of life and death, it was Silas who wielded the lash. In this world of stifling heat and simmering tension, Maria had learned to cultivate a profound stillness. Her face was often a placid mask, revealing nothing of the thoughts that churned behind her eyes. She had to be more than a cook. She had to be an observer, a student of the moods and tempers of the great house. She knew the meaning of a door slammed, the significance of a raised voice in the parlor, the subtle shift in the mistress's tone that could signal an impending storm. The kitchen, with its constant heat and labor, was also a sanctuary of sorts. Here, she was the master of her craft. Here, she could wield a small, fragile form of power. The fire in the hearth was hers to command, its heat a force of creation that could transform raw, humble ingredients into something magnificent. But fire, she knew, was a dual-natured thing. It could warm, and it could nourish. It could also purify. It could also destroy. As she stood before the roaring flames day after day, year after year, her hands moving with the practiced grace of a master artisan, a different kind of recipe was beginning to take shape in the quiet, guarded corners of her mind. The daily rituals of her servitude, the very tools of her bondage, were slowly revealing themselves to be the instruments of a rebellion yet to come. The first spark had not yet been struck, but the kindling was being gathered, piece by patient piece, in the smoky heart of the plantation kitchen. The fragile ecosystem of the Duval plantation was governed by a set of unwritten, yet brutally enforced laws. One of these was the rigid economy of sustenance. Every morsel of food, every scrap of fat, every broken crust of bread was an asset belonging to the master. It was inventoried, allocated, and consumed according to a strict hierarchy that placed the enslaved at the very bottom, just above the livestock. To divert this flow was not an act of charity. It was an act of theft, a disruption of the natural order as defined by the lash in the ledger book. Maria, who presided over the source of this flow, understood this calculus better than anyone. Her position required her to be both a creator of abundance and a guardian against the desperate hunger that was a constant, gnawing presence just outside the kitchen door. The contradiction was a weight she carried every day, a silent tension that hummed beneath the rhythms of her work. One evening, after the last platters had been sent to the great house and the clatter of silver had subsided, Maria began the long process of cleaning. The kitchen was a cavern of shadows, the fire in the great hearth banked to a sullen red glow. The air, still thick with the lingering ghosts of roasted meat and savory sauces, had begun to cool, the oppressive heat of the day finally relenting to the damp chill of the Louisiana night. On a wooden board near the butcher's block lay the remains of the evening's labor, a small pile of fatty trimmings, the gristly ends of a beef roast, and a handful of cornbread muffins that had been slightly burned on the bottom, rendering them unsuitable for the master's table. To the household, this was refuse, destined for the slop bucket that would feed the hounds. But to the children who worked the fields, whose daily ration was a meager portion of grits and salt pork, it was a feast. She saw them from the corner of her eye, two small figures hovering in the deep shadows just beyond the kitchen's open doorway. They did not speak, did not make a sound. Their presence was a silent, desperate plea. They were impossibly thin, their limbs like brittle twigs, their eyes large and dark in their dust-streaked faces. They were the children of the field hands, sent out after a day of back-breaking labor to forage for whatever they could find, a stray chicken egg, a forgotten turnip. Maria's own child, a boy named Samuel, had been sold away 5 years prior, a memory that was a constant, dull ache in her chest. In the hollow eyes of these children, She saw a reflection of her own loss, a ghost of the hunger she could never satisfy. For a long moment, she remained still, her back to them, her hands submerged in a basin of greasy water. Her mind was a battlefield of conflicting impulses, the ingrained caution of a survivor against the profound, almost physical ache of compassion. The decision, when it came, was not a decision at all, but a surrender. With a swift, almost unconscious movement, she scraped the trimmings and the broken cornbread into a piece of rough muslin cloth, bundled it tightly, and placed it on the threshold of the door. She did not turn, did not acknowledge the rustle of movement as the small bundle disappeared into the darkness. She said nothing. It was a small act, a gesture that would go unnoticed in the grand scheme of the plantation's daily cruelties, but it was a transgression, a crack in the dam of her carefully constructed compliance. And Silas Crane, the overseer, was a man who noticed every crack. He seemed to materialize from the darkness, his presence announced not by the sound of his footsteps, but by a sudden drop in the ambient temperature of the night. He stood just where the children had been, his thin frame silhouetted against the dim light of the kitchen. His pale eyes, cold and reptilian, were fixed on Mariah. He did not raise his voice. Shouting was a tool for lesser men. Silas preferred a quiet, surgical cruelty. He said that he had seen what she had done. He explained, in a voice devoid of any emotion, that she had taken food that belonged to the master's hounds and given it to field hands. He spoke of it as a purely logistical matter, a misallocation of resources. The children, in his view, were units of labor, their energy already accounted for by their daily rations. The hounds were an investment, used to track runaways and protect the property. By her actions, she had valued the former over the latter, an error in judgment that required correction. He made her watch as he retrieved the muslin bundle from the children, who had been caught before they could reach the relative safety of their cabins. He did not strike them. Instead, he made them stand and witness as he unceremoniously tossed the scraps to the dogs, who fell upon them with a frenzy of snarls and snapping jaws. The punishment for Mariah was not the lash, not this time. It was humiliation. He ordered her to scrub the entire kitchen floor, from the hearth to the doorway, on her hands and knees with a coarse brush and lye soap, a task that would take her until dawn. As she worked, the harsh smell of the lye burning her nostrils, the rough planks scraping the skin from her knees, his words echoed in her mind. He had not punished her for her kindness. He had punished her for her inefficiency. He had reduced her act of human empathy to a line item in a ledger of brutality. The fury that kindled within her was cold, precise, and utterly silent. The second assault on her spirit came not from the yard, but from within the great house itself. It came from Mistress Elise Duval, a woman whose physical delicacy concealed a will of iron and a casual cruelty born of absolute power. Elise moved through her world as if it were a stage set designed for her comfort. She was draped in fine silks, her scent a cloud of French perfume that did little to mask the cloying odor of decay that seemed to cling to the plantation. Her weapon of choice was not physical violence, but a finely honed psychological torment, a constant chipping away at the dignity of those she considered her lessers. The pantry, a cool, dark room lined with shelves of preserves, barrels of flour, and sacks of sugar, was her domain. It was a symbol of her status as the lady of the house, a testament to her family's wealth and foresight. One afternoon, she summoned Mariah to this sanctuary of abundance. The air within was still and smelled of dust, dried herbs, and the sweet, almost intoxicating scent of raw sugar. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the single grime-covered window, illuminating floating motes of dust in its narrow shafts. Mistress Elise stood with one gloved hand resting on a large sack of refined white sugar, a sack that was now noticeably less full than it had been. She began by speaking of the importance of trust in a household. She said that she had always considered Mariah to be reliable, a cut above the others. Her voice was soft, laced with a tone of profound disappointment that was far more cutting than any outright anger. She explained that a significant quantity of sugar was missing. She said that no one else had a key to the pantry except for herself and Mariah. The implication hung in the silent, sweet-smelling air between them, as heavy and suffocating as the summer heat. Mariah stood motionless, her hands clasped before her gaze fixed on a point on the floor just to the left of the mistress's silk slippers. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she had not taken the sugar. She suspected the mistress's own wastrel brother, a frequent visitor who was known for his gambling debts and his fondness for sweet liquor, but to voice such a suspicion would be an act of suicide. She could say nothing. Her silence was taken as an admission of guilt. Mistress Elise sighed, a sound of theatrical sorrow. She told Mariah that she was deeply hurt by this betrayal of her trust. She spoke of the cost of the sugar, of the difficulty of procuring such fine quality goods. She did not accuse Mariah directly. Her method was more insidious. She simply presented the facts as she saw them, constructing a cage of circumstantial evidence from which there was no escape. Mariah's punishment, the mistress declared, would be a lesson in the value of what she had stolen. For the next month, her own meager ration of molasses would be withheld. It was a petty cruelty, a punishment that would cause her no real physical harm, but it was a profound act of psychological warfare. In the one place where Mariah's skill and integrity were undeniable, in the heart of her own domain of provisions and ingredients, she had been branded a thief. She was being punished for a crime she did not commit, by a woman who consumed the fruits of her labor without a moment's thought. As she walked back to the kitchen, the sweet smell of the pantry clinging to her clothes, the cold fire within her burned a little brighter. The culmination of these daily cruelties, the event that would irrevocably alter the course of her life, occurred on a sweltering night in late August. Master Augustine was hosting a lavish dinner for a group of neighboring planters and their overseers. It was an occasion for boasting, for talk of crop yields, slave prices, and politics. From her kitchen, Mariah could hear the rising tide of their voices, the hearty, self-satisfied laughter of men secure in their power. She had worked for 3 days to prepare for this feast. The dining room of the great house was an island of light and civility, its long mahogany table set with Irish linen, polished silver, and sparkling crystal goblets filled with claret. The air was filled with the scent of roasted duck, spiced ham, and the warm, yeasty aroma of the bread she had baked that morning. But Mariah was not in her kitchen. She was in the yard, her wrists bound tightly to the thick, unyielding trunk of a magnolia tree. A summer storm had just passed, and the air was heavy with the smell of rain and damp earth. Water dripped steadily from the broad, waxy leaves of the magnolia, each drop a cold, percussive note in the suffocating humidity. The light from the dining room windows cast long, distorted rectangles across the wet ground, illuminating the scene in a sickly yellow glow. From within the house, she could hear the sound of a violin, a cheerful, elegant melody that was a grotesque counterpoint to the scene unfolding in the yard. Silas Crane stood before her, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a leather whip coiled in his hand. Her supposed crime, this time, was insolence. She had failed to lower her eyes quickly enough when he had addressed her earlier in the day. It was a pretext, a flimsy excuse for the exercise of power, and they both knew it. Master Augustine had been informed of her transgression just as his guests were arriving. He had waved a dismissive hand and told Silas to handle it. He said that discipline must be maintained, but that the cook should not be damaged so badly that she could not prepare breakfast in the morning. He had then turned his attention to his guests, his mind already on the wine and the conversation. He was feasting on the food that she had prepared, in a room warmed by candles and fellowship, while she was being whipped just beyond his window. The first lash was a line of pure, white-hot fire across her back. The sound of it, a sharp, wet crack, was swallowed by the night and the chirping of the cicadas. She did not scream. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, her body rigid against the rough bark of the tree. Her focus narrowed to the sounds from the house, the clink of a fork against a plate, a burst of deep-throated laughter from her master, the soaring notes of the violin. Each sound was a fresh insult, a new layer of humiliation laid upon the raw agony of her flesh. Silas was methodical, his movements efficient and unhurried. He was not angry. For him, this was merely a part of his job, no different from mending a fence or breaking a horse. The rain began to fall again, a soft, warm drizzle that mingled with the sweat and blood on her back. It dripped from the magnolia leaves, tracing cold paths through her hair and down her face. In the flickering light from the house, the scene took on the quality of a nightmare. The elegant sounds of the party, the relentless rhythmic crack of the whip, the silent, enduring figure of the woman tied to the tree. As the ordeal continued, something inside Mariah shifted. The pain, the humiliation, the rage, it all began to cool and solidify, hardening into a single, unyielding purpose. The historian might note that this was the moment her resolve was forged. The truth is that this was the moment her soul was cauterized. When Silas was finally finished, he left her there, tied to the tree in the rain. The party in the great house continued for another hour, its sounds a final, lingering torture. When she was finally cut down, she did not return to her cabin. She walked back to the one place that was truly hers. In the dark, silent kitchen, surrounded by the tools of her craft, Mariah began to plot. Her mind, now a landscape of cold, clear fury, turned to the herbs in the rafters, the roots in the garden, and the dark, hidden knowledge of the swamp. The cruelty of the household had provided her with a motive. Now, her kitchen would provide her with the means. The aftermath of the whipping was not a period of healing, but one of profound and chilling transformation. The raw, searing pain in Mariah's back eventually subsided into a dull, permanent ache, a physical reminder of the spiritual wound that would not close. But the fire that had been kindled by years of quiet indignities and stoked by the lash did not extinguish. Instead, it retreated deep inside her, collapsing into a single, dense point of cold, white-hot purpose. The woman who moved through the smoky kitchen in the days that followed was a different entity from the one who had been tied to the magnolia tree. Her movements, once fluid and economical, were now imbued with an almost frightening deliberation. Her hands, which had for so long been instruments of nourishment, were being repurposed. The rage had burned away, leaving behind the hard, unyielding clarity of a verdict that had already been delivered. All that remained was the execution. Her new classroom was the swamp, the vast, menacing wilderness that bordered the plantation's cultivated fields. Under the cloak of the darkest nights, when the moon was a sliver of bone behind a veil of clouds, she would slip away from her cabin. The swamp was a place the overseers avoided after dark, a domain of unseen things, of sucking mud and water moccasins as thick as a man's arm. For Mariah, however, it had become a place of pilgrimage. She moved through it not with fear, but with a hunter's focus, her senses attuned to its secret language. The air was thick with the smell of decay and fecundity, of damp earth and sweet rotting vegetation. Cypress knees rose from the black, still water like grave markers. The night was a cacophony of sound, the basso profondo of bullfrogs, the high, sawing whine of insects, the sudden, startling splash of some unseen creature. She was in search of a specific kind of knowledge, a dangerous botany that grew only in the shadows, far from the master's manicured gardens. Her guide in this new curriculum was a man named Jonah, an elderly, stooped figure who lived in a small, isolated cabin at the farthest edge of the plantation's property, where the cotton fields gave way to the untamed swamp. Jonah was a root doctor, a keeper of the old ways, a man whose knowledge was a tapestry woven from African traditions and a deep, intuitive understanding of the local flora. He was regarded with a mixture of fear and respect by the other enslaved people, and largely ignored by the white masters, who dismissed his practices as primitive superstition. Jonah had a face like a dried apple, a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a lifetime spent under the harsh Louisiana sun. His one humanizing grace was a collection of small, intricate birdhouses he carved from cypress wood, a gentle craft that stood in stark contrast to the darker applications of his knowledge. He had seen the look in Mariah's eyes when she first came to him, a look he recognized from a lifetime of witnessing suffering. It was the look of a soul that had been pushed past the point of endurance, a spirit that had turned from seeking solace to seeking retribution. He did not ask for her story. He simply listened to her questions, his own dark eyes unreadable. She asked about roots that could sour milk, about leaves that could bring on a fever, about berries that could quiet a colicky baby. Her inquiries were a slow, cautious dance around the subject that truly consumed her. Jonah answered in parables, in riddles, speaking of the dual nature of all things that grew from the earth. He told her that a plant that could heal in small doses could kill in large ones. He said that the same root that could ease a woman's labor pains could also stop a man's heart. He showed her the glossy, dark leaves of the nightshade, its seductive, purple-black berries like drops of solidified darkness. He pointed out the trumpet-shaped flowers of the Jimson weed, a plant he called the devil's snare, whose seeds, he warned, could steal a man's mind before they stole his life. He taught her how to identify them by the shape of their leaves, by the smell of their crushed stems, by the way they seemed to draw the shadows around them. He imparted this knowledge with a profound sadness, the weariness of a man who understood that he was handing her a weapon forged from the very earth itself. He gave her no instructions, offered no encouragement. He simply answered her questions, becoming a living index of the swamp's hidden arsenal. With this new and terrible knowledge, Mariah's kitchen transformed. By day, it remained the engine of the great house, producing the fragrant breads, savory roasts, and delicate pastries that Master Augustine demanded. But by night, it became an apothecary's workshop, a laboratory for a slow, methodical science of death. The familiar tools of her trade took on sinister new purposes. The large stone mortar and pestle, normally used for grinding spices, was now employed to pulverize dried Jimson weed seeds into a fine, almost weightless powder. She would work by the faint, flickering light of a single tallow candle, her shadow a huge, monstrous thing dancing on the brick walls. The rhythmic crunch and scrape of the stone was the only sound, a stark, lonely metronome marking the slow, deliberate progress of her plan. She learned the properties of her chosen ingredients with the patience of a master craftsman. She discovered that the nightshade berries, when cooked down and strained, produced a thick, dark liquid that was almost tasteless, easily lost in the rich, complex flavors of a dark gravy or a fruit preserve. The powdered seeds of the devil's snare, she found, dissolved readily in alcohol, leaving no trace. She began to experiment with dosage, her methods precise and horrifyingly domestic. She would take a small portion of the day's leftover stew, a meal destined for the field hands, and carefully measure in a minuscule amount of her preparations. This was not her target. This was a calibration. She had to understand the potency of her work, the time it would take to manifest. She watched the other slaves for any sign of illness, any complaint of stomach cramps or dizziness, adjusting her formulas based on these subtle, unwitting bioassays. Her focus was absolute, her demeanor so calm and unchanged that no one suspected the horrifying nature of her nightly work. She was surrounded by the raw materials of life, yet her every thought was bent toward its violent conclusion. Her activities, however, did not go entirely unnoticed. The enslaved community was a world of whispers and watchful eyes, a network of communication that operated just beneath the surface of the master's awareness. A young woman named Sarah, who worked in the laundry, saw Mariah returning from the swamp one night, her apron stained with mud and carrying a bundle of unfamiliar plants. She saw the intense, almost feral concentration on Mariah's face as she worked late into the night. One evening, Sarah found the courage to approach the kitchen, her voice a barely audible whisper. She warned Mariah that what she was doing was dangerous, that if she were caught, the retribution would fall not just on her, but on everyone. She said that people were afraid. Mariah did not look up from the seeds she was carefully separating from their thorny pod. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was flat, devoid of heat or passion, the voice of someone stating an undeniable, elemental truth. She said that they will taste what they have fed us. The words hung in the smoky air, an epitaph and a promise. Sarah backed away, a profound chill running through her despite the kitchen's oppressive warmth. She had seen that Mariah was no longer one of them. She was an instrument of a justice so terrible it eclipsed any fear of the consequences. The final phase of her preparation required a more definitive test. She needed to be certain of the outcome, to eliminate any margin of error. Her chosen subjects were the plantation's stray dogs and the pigs kept in a pen behind the smokehouse. They were, in the cold logic of her new world, the perfect analogs for her intended victims: greedy, loud, and utterly disposable. One evening, she prepared a special meal. She took the richest, fattiest scraps from the master's table, the kind of meal that would drive the animals into a frenzy, and laced them with a carefully measured combination of her deadliest concoctions. She mixed the dark nightshade extract into the gravy, stirred the powdered seeds into the mashed sweet potatoes. The food looked and smelled no different from the usual refuse. She left the tainted meal in a wooden bowl near the edge of the woods for the stray hounds, and poured a similar mixture into the trough for the pigs. Then, she watched. From the deep shadows of the kitchen doorway, she observed the scene with the detached curiosity of a natural philosopher. A lean, half-wild dog, its ribs showing through its mangy coat, was the first to find the bowl. It fell upon the food with desperate, gulping noises. Within the hour, the dog began to stumble, its hind legs losing coordination. It whined, a low, confused sound, and then began to foam at the mouth, its body convulsing in a series of violent, uncontrollable spasms. By midnight, it was still, its lifeless body a dark shape in the moonlight. The pigs took longer. They were larger, their constitutions more robust. But by dawn, 2 of the 5 lay dead in the mud of their pen, their bodies bloated, their skins a sickly, mottled purple. The others were clearly distressed, grunting in pain, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The trial was a complete, unqualified success. The method was proven, the weapon was perfected. Standing there in the cool, gray light of the approaching dawn, the smell of death mingling with the familiar morning scents of wood smoke and dew-damp earth. Mariah felt nothing. There was no triumph, no remorse, no fear. There was only the quiet, grim satisfaction of a difficult task brought to its penultimate stage. She had transformed the most fundamental act of care, the preparation of food, into a vector for a terrible and final judgment. The grand feast Master Augustine was planning for the end of the harvest season, an event intended to celebrate his wealth and power, would now serve a different purpose. It would be her stage, and the silver platters and fine china her delivery system. The transition from planning to execution was now complete. The poison was in the pot, and the table was about to be set. The evening of the harvest feast descended upon the Duval plantation like a shroud. The oppressive heat of the day had finally broken, leaving behind a thick, breathless humidity that clung to the skin and muted the sounds of the night. A full, bloated moon hung in the inky sky, its pale light struggling to pierce the canopy of the ancient oaks, casting the world in a stark relief of silver and shadow. The great house, however, was an island of defiant brilliance, every window blazing with the warm, buttery light of 100 beeswax candles. It was a beacon in the vast darkness of the Louisiana landscape, a symbol of Master Augustine's dominion over the land and all who inhabited it. Carriages had been arriving since dusk, their iron-rimmed wheels crunching on the crushed shell driveway, disgorging a steady stream of the parish's most powerful men. They were the planters, the architects of this brutal kingdom, men whose wealth was measured in acres of cotton and sugarcane, and in the number of human souls they owned. Inside, the dining room was a theater of calculated opulence. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflected the flickering constellation of the silver candelabras that ran its length. It was set for 24 guests, a landscape of pristine Irish linen, heavy, ornate silverware, and delicate crystal goblets that refracted the candlelight into 1,000 tiny rainbows. The air was thick with the scent of wealth, the beeswax from the candles, the lemon and lavender polish used on the furniture, the faint, floral perfume of the magnolia blossoms that filled a large porcelain vase in the center of the table, and, increasingly, the rich, savory aromas wafting from Mariah's kitchen. This was the pinnacle of Master Augustine's world, the physical manifestation of his success. He stood at the head of the table, his large frame squeezed into a fine wool coat despite the cloying warmth of the room. His face was flushed with wine and pride, his booming laughter the dominant note in the rising symphony of conversation. His guests were men cut from the same cloth. They were landowners and overseers, their hands softened by wealth or hardened by the daily administration of cruelty. They spoke of crop prices, of the latest tariffs, of the troublesome politics coming out of Washington. They traded stories of recalcitrant slaves and the most effective methods for breaking a man's spirit. A planter named Alistair, a man with a perpetually sneering expression, was recounting a tale of a runaway he had recently captured, describing the man's punishment in grim, appreciative detail. His words were punctuated by the nods and grunts of his audience, their conversation a casual litany of human suffering, as unremarkable to them as discussing the weather. Silas Crane was there, of course. He did not sit at the main table with the planters, but at a smaller one set slightly apart, a position that marked his status as a subordinate, yet a crucial one. He was, as always, a specter of quiet menace, his pale eyes scanning the room, his presence a silent reminder of the violence that underpinned this elegant affair. He ate and drank sparingly, a coiled spring of vigilance in a room given over to indulgence. Through all of this, Mariah moved like a ghost. She had spent the last 3 days in a state of preternatural focus, a whirlwind of silent, purposeful activity. Now, as the feast began, a profound and unnerving calm had settled over her. She was no longer a person. She was a function, a delivery mechanism for the judgment she had so carefully prepared. She entered the dining room, carrying the first course, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wooden floor. In her hands was a massive silver tureen, the steam rising from it carrying the rich, complex aroma of her famous gumbo. The scent filled the room, momentarily silencing the conversation as the planters turned their heads, their appetites stirred. She did not meet anyone's gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the task at hand, her face a placid, unreadable mask. She ladled the dark, fragrant stew into the porcelain bowls held by the younger house servants, who then scurried to place them before the guests. She served her master first. As she leaned over his shoulder, the heat from the tureen warming her arm, she could smell the sour scent of wine on his breath. He clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture of proprietary satisfaction, and declared to the table that no one in the whole of Louisiana could make a gumbo like his Mariah. He said her roux was as dark and mysterious as the swamp itself. The men around the table murmured their agreement, their spoons already dipping into their bowls. Mariah moved on, her expression unchanging, her heart a cold, still stone in her chest. She ensured that Silas Crane received a generous portion, the ladle scraping the bottom of the tureen to scoop up the richest pieces of sausage and shrimp, where she knew the concentration of her work was the greatest. He gave her a curt, dismissive nod, his attention already on the food. For a long, agonizing stretch of time, everything was normal. The room was filled with the sounds of contented eating, the scrape of silver spoons against porcelain, the appreciative murmurs of the guests. They praised the depth of the flavor, the tenderness of the meat, the perfect balance of spices. They were consuming their own doom, and they were savoring every bite. Mariah retreated to the shadows near the doorway, her role as cook momentarily complete, her new role as observer just beginning. She watched them, her gaze moving from one face to the next, cataloging the men who had laughed at her pain, who had profited from her bondage, who had built their comfortable lives on a foundation of human misery. She watched Augustine wipe his lips with a linen napkin, a smear of dark roux on the white cloth. She watched Silas Crane eat with his usual efficiency, his jaw working methodically, his cold eyes betraying no pleasure, only a mechanical need for sustenance. The first sign was almost imperceptible. It was Alistair, the man who had been boasting of his cruelty. He paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth, and gave a small, dry cough. He took a long drink of wine, cleared his throat, and resumed his meal, the moment passing almost unnoticed. But Mariah had noticed. It was the beginning, the first tremor before the earthquake. The house servants cleared the gumbo bowls, and Mariah returned to the kitchen to orchestrate the arrival of the main course. Platters of roasted fowl, glistening with butter and herbs, ham studded with cloves, bowls of sweet potatoes mashed with molasses, and mountains of her light, fluffy bread were brought into the room. The feast continued, the volume of the conversation rising again, fueled by more wine and the sheer, gluttonous pleasure of the meal. Then, the second tremor. A portly planter named Bartholomew, who was in the middle of a loud, rambling story, suddenly went silent. His face, already flushed from wine, seemed to darken to a shade of plum. A look of profound confusion crossed his features. He put a hand to his collar, as if his neckcloth had suddenly become too tight. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged. His wine goblet slipped from his grasp, falling to the thick rug with a dull thud, its crimson contents spreading across the floor. Across the table, another man abruptly pushed his chair back, a look of panic in his eyes. He said that he felt unwell, that the room was spinning, and then The mask of civility did not just slip, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. Silas Crane let out a strangled cry, a sound so alien and raw that it cut through the rising panic in the room. His fork clattered loudly onto his plate. He tried to stand, his body rigid, his hands clawing at his throat as if trying to rip out an invisible obstruction. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he stumbled backwards, his eyes, those cold, observant eyes, now wide with a terror that was absolute and animalistic. He fell to his knees, his body convulsed by a violent, silent paroxysm. He was a man defined by control, by the precise application of force, and now his own body had become his torturer, betraying him in the most intimate and violent way imaginable. All eyes now turned to the head of the table. Master Augustin Duval had risen halfway from his chair, his great bulk trembling. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked from the convulsing form of his overseer to the other men who were now succumbing, some slumping forward in their chairs, others clutching their chests, their breaths coming in ragged, tearing gasps. His gaze swept the room, wild and desperate, and finally it landed on Mariah, who stood unmoving in the doorway. In that final, fleeting moment of clarity, he understood. The realization was a visible thing, a wave of pure, unadulterated terror that washed over his features, erasing the arrogance and the pride, leaving only the stark, primal fear of a man facing his own imminent and violent death. He tried to point at her, to scream her name, but his throat had closed. He made a sound like a drowning man, and then he collapsed forward, his face landing with a soft, wet thud in a plate of sweet cakes, his massive frame sending a shudder through the entire length of the table. The dining room descended into utter pandemonium. It was a scene from a madman's vision of hell. The air was filled with the sounds of choking, of men retching violently onto the pristine linen, their bodies heaving in the final, agonizing rebellion of their poisoned systems. Chairs were overturned. Silver platters laden with food crashed to the floor. A man, blinded by pain, staggered into a candelabra, sending it toppling, its candles scattering and sputtering on the wine-soaked rug. The beautiful, orderly room was transformed into a charnel house, the carefully constructed illusion of Gentile society dissolving in a tide of vomit and death. The house servants, who had been frozen in terror against the walls, now broke and fled, their screams adding to the cacophony. Through it all, Mariah remained in the doorway, a pillar of stillness in the heart of the storm. She watched the death of her world, the violent end of the men who had defined its every cruelty. She saw Alistair, his face blue, his body still. She saw Bartholomew, slumped over the table, a trickle of blood on his chin. She saw Silas, his final, shuddering breath exhaled onto the floorboards he had so often strode with impunity. She saw her master, his face half submerged in the very sweetness he had craved, his reign ending not with a bang, but with a choked, pathetic whimper. There was no joy on her face, no satisfaction. There was only a vast, empty calm. The vengeance she had sought was not a release, it was a conclusion. It was the final logical step in a long and brutal equation. The path of her revenge, however, was not as precise as her poison. Not every man at the table had eaten the gumbo or the cakes. Several of the younger overseers, and a few of the planters who had arrived late, had only partaken of the roasted fowl and the bread, dishes she had left untouched. They now staggered back, their faces pale with shock and horror, their minds struggling to comprehend the massacre that had unfolded before them. The screams of the dying had faded, replaced by the low, agonizing groans of those who still clung to life. One of the survivors, a planter from a neighboring estate, finally found his voice. He pointed a trembling finger, not at the dead, but at the living. His eyes, wide with a furious, terrified certainty, swept past the carnage and fixed upon the remaining servants cowering in the hallway, and then, with dawning absolute conviction, they locked onto Mariah. The question of her freedom had been answered. Her vengeance had not destroyed everyone in its path, and those who remained would now demand a retribution of their own, a new chapter of violence born from the ashes of the feast of death. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was not a silence, but a vacuum. The abrupt cessation of screaming and choking left a void that was quickly filled by the low, wet sounds of the dying and the frantic, ragged breathing of the survivors. For a long, suspended moment, the living stood frozen amidst the wreckage of the feast, their minds unable to process the sheer, bloody totality of what had transpired. The elegant dining room, only an hour before a symbol of their unassailable power, was now a tableau of grotesque death. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sour stench of vomit, a miasma that clung to the heavy silk draperies and settled upon the uneaten food. The flickering candlelight cast a sick, wavering illumination on the scene, making the shadows writhe and dance, lending a horrifying semblance of life to the contorted bodies of the dead. This paralysis of shock, however, was fleeting. It was broken by a single, raw scream from one of the house servants, a young woman who had been hiding in the hallway. That sound, a pure, piercing note of animal terror, shattered the spell. The surviving planters, their faces ashen, their fine clothes spattered with the evidence of the night's carnage, stumbled back from the table as if it were a venomous thing. Their fear, primal and disbelieving, was a volatile substance. It needed a vessel, an object upon which to fix itself, and in the absence of a comprehensible explanation, it curdled into a dark and immediate suspicion that was as old as the institution of slavery itself. Conspiracy. The thought did not form as a reasoned conclusion. It erupted, fully formed and unassailable, in their panicked minds. This could not be the work of a single cook. This was an uprising. This feast was meant to be the first blow in a coordinated, parish-wide rebellion. The first of the survivors to flee the house did not run for help, but for a weapon. He burst out into the humid night, his shouts ragged and incoherent, his words a jumble of poison, death, and insurrection. The news spread from the great house with the speed of a grass fire. The carriage drivers waiting in the darkness, the servants lurking in the outbuildings, the enslaved families in their distant cabins, they all heard the first shouts of alarm. The terror was contagious. The few surviving guests who had managed to escape the dining room became apostles of this new, terrifying gospel. They seized their horses, their movements clumsy with panic, and rode like madmen into the night, their destination the neighboring plantations. They were not merely spreading news. They were sounding a call to arms. They carried with them a vision of absolute horror, of masters and overseers struck down at their own tables, of the brutal, swift inversion of the natural order. They spoke of a vast, unseen plot, a web of treachery that had been spun in the secret spaces of the slave quarters. In less than an hour, the response began to materialize. From the dark, winding roads that snaked through the swamps and cotton fields, riders began to converge on the Duval plantation. They were a grim procession, their progress marked by the bobbing, unsteady light of pine knot torches. These were the vigilantes, the self-appointed enforcers of the brutal code that governed their world. They were planters, their sons, and their overseers, their faces grim masks of fury in the flickering torchlight. Their fear had now fully transformed into a righteous, unthinking rage. They were not coming to investigate a crime. They were coming to extinguish a rebellion, to cauterize a wound before the infection could spread. Their first act was to establish a perimeter around the slave quarters, a ring of armed men and barking dogs that cut off any possibility of escape. Then, with a systematic and terrifying efficiency, they began to drag the enslaved families from their cabins. Men, women, and children were forced out into the open, their night clothes their only protection against the damp night air, their faces a mixture of confusion and stark terror. They were herded into a tight, trembling group in the center of the yard, the torchlight casting their shadows long and distorted against the walls of their homes. The vigilantes moved among them, their voices low and menacing, their questions a barrage of accusations. They demanded to know who else was involved. They asked where the other conspirators were hiding. They promised swift mercy in exchange for names. The protestations of innocence, the pleas of ignorance, were met with the backs of hands and the butts of rifles. To the planters, this silence was not a sign of innocence, but proof of a deep and unshakable loyalty to the conspiracy. Each denial only tightened the coil of their fury. While this chaotic inquisition unfolded, another group of men stormed the great house. They moved with a kind of revulsion, as if entering a tomb. They found Mariah in the kitchen. She had not fled. She was standing by the cold hearth, her hands empty, her face calm. She offered no resistance as they seized her, her body limp in their rough grasp. There was no trial, no pretense of justice. Her presence in the kitchen, the epicenter of the horror, was confession enough. They dragged her from the house and into the yard, into the center of the ring of torchlight and terrified faces. She was thrown to the ground before the assembled planters, the men whose friends and brothers now lay dead in the dining room. The retribution was swift and hideously public. They tore the dress from her back, exposing the half-healed scars from Silas Crane's last whipping, a sight that only seemed to inflame their rage further. She was dragged to the same thick-trunked magnolia tree where she had been punished before, its broad, waxy leaves now illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the torches. This was not a whipping for discipline. It was a ritual of torture, an attempt to break not just her body, but the spirit of anyone who might dare to witness it. The lashes fell with a brutal, relentless rhythm, the sound a wet, tearing counterpoint to the weeping of the women and the frightened whimpering of the children who were being forced to watch. Through it all, Mariah remained silent. She did not scream, did not beg for mercy. Her silence was an act of final, profound defiance, a denial of their power to elicit the confession they so desperately craved. Her refusal to name accomplices, to validate their theory of a grand conspiracy, was, to them, the ultimate act of insolence. It drove them to a new level of frenzy. When the whipping was done, they did not release her. They bound her, bleeding and broken, to the tree with heavy iron chains brought from the smokehouse. She was left there, a public monument to the consequences of rebellion, a grim warning to all who watched. But even this was not enough to satisfy the bloodlust that had been unleashed. The planters, their faces slick with sweat and illuminated by the dancing flames, looked from the woman on the tree to the great house that stood behind her. The house, the site of their humiliation, had become a cursed place. It was a monument to their own vulnerability, a testament to the fact that their power, which they had believed to be absolute, could be undone by the hands of a single, determined cook. The evidence of the feast, the poisoned food still sitting on the silver platters, the bodies of their comrades slumped in their chairs, was an intolerable stain on their honor. It had to be erased. The decision to burn the house was not debated. It was a collective, unspoken consensus, an act of primal, purifying rage. They used their torches, thrusting them into the fine silk curtains that hung in the windows of the dining room. The dry, aged fabric caught instantly. the flames climbing the length of the curtains with a hungry, whispering sound. For a moment, the fire was contained, a bright orange square framed by the window, a beautiful and terrible painting. Then, a pane of glass, stressed by the intense heat, shattered with a sound like a pistol shot. The night air rushed into the room, feeding the flames, and the fire roared to life. It moved with an incredible speed, consuming the symbols of Augustine Duval's wealth with an indiscriminate hunger. It devoured the mahogany table, the silk-upholstered chairs, the family portraits that lined the walls. The fire spread upwards, bursting through the roof in a great geyser of sparks and embers that rose into the night sky, a fiery column against the dark backdrop of the swamp. The entire plantation was bathed in its flickering, apocalyptic light. The roar of the blaze was a living thing, a deep, continuous sound like a beast in its death throes, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers and the crash of collapsing floors. The heat was immense, a physical wave that pushed the onlookers back, their faces lit with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. The great house, the symbol of order and dominion, was being consumed by a force of pure chaos. It burned for hours, a funeral pyre for the masters and a terrifying spectacle for the enslaved. For Mariah, chained to the tree, the fire was the last thing she would see. The inferno was a reflection of the one that had burned within her, now made manifest. A raging, uncontrollable force that would consume everything in its path. She watched as the proud white columns blackened and collapsed, as the roof fell in, sending a shower of sparks toward the indifferent moon. The vengeance she had so meticulously planned had brought not justice, not freedom, but a greater, more terrible curse. It had unleashed a force of retribution that would not be satisfied with her death alone. The flames of the Duval plantation house were a signal, a beacon of terror that would burn its way across the parish, its smoke carrying a message of brutal, uncompromising reprisal, ensuring that the true history of what happened that night would be buried under a thick layer of ash and fear, left to become a dark and whispered legend. The official history of the Duval plantation ends in fire and silence. Parish records from 1831 note the destruction of the great house in a catastrophic blaze, an event that claimed the lives of Augustine Duval and a number of his prominent guests. The cause was listed as accidental, a tragic consequence of overturned candles during a boisterous harvest celebration. The subsequent and brutal suppression of the enslaved population was documented as a necessary precaution to quell unrest in the wake of the tragedy. Mariah is mentioned only once, in a single, chilling line in the overseer's log from a neighboring plantation, noting her execution for unspecified crimes. The historical record, written by the victors, is a neat and tidy narrative of misfortune and control. It is a lie, a thick layer of ash shoveled over a chasm of truth. But history is not only what is written, it is also what is remembered, what is whispered in the dark, and what refuses to be erased from the land itself. In the decades that followed the fire, the land was sold, divided, and sold again. The fields, once meticulously cultivated, were allowed to go fallow. The swamp, ever patient, began its slow, inexorable work of reclamation. The forest crept back in, its vines and creepers pulling down the fences, its roots buckling the foundations of the outbuildings. The sugar mill collapsed into a skeletal ruin of rust and rotting timber. The slave cabins were consumed by the earth, their mud and moss walls dissolving back into the landscape from which they were made, leaving only faint, rectangular depressions in the soil, like shallow, empty graves. Of the entire Duval enterprise, of that entire kingdom of vanity and suffering, only one structure managed to defy the relentless siege of time and nature: the kitchen chimney. It still stands today, a stark and solitary monument in a sea of tangled green. It is a blackened finger pointing at the sky, visible from the slow-moving waters of a nearby bayou. The great house it once served is gone, its bricks scattered and buried. But the chimney, the heart of Mariah's domain, endures. To visit the site is to step into a place where time has become thin. The air is different here, heavy and still, freighted with the weight of memory. The chimney rises from a thick carpet of moss and ferns, its bricks stained a permanent, deep charcoal from the inferno that consumed the rest of the house. The soot is not a uniform black, but a layered patina of ash, gray, and even a strange, rust-colored stain, where rainwater has leached minerals from the clay for nearly 2 centuries. The mortar between the bricks has crumbled away in places, creating dark crevices where lizards and insects make their homes. Thick, woody vines, some as thick as a man's wrist, cling to its surface, their green leaves a stark contrast against the blackened brick, as if the swamp itself is trying to pull the structure down into a final embrace. The great fireplace at its base is a gaping, shadowed mouth, choked with fallen leaves and debris. Standing before it, one can almost feel a phantom heat, a ghost of the 1,000 fires that once roared within its depths. It is a profoundly unsettling place, an architectural scar on the land, a silent witness that refuses to fall. But the legacy of that night is not confined to this single, defiant ruin. It has seeped into the soil, into the water, and into the folklore of the region. It has become a story, a cautionary tale told by Cajun trappers and the descendants of the enslaved families who survived the brutal retribution. They are the unofficial archivists, the keepers of the history that was never written down. They say that the land around the old Duval place is tainted, that it holds a bitterness that even the sweet scent of the magnolias cannot conceal. Travelers who find themselves on the winding, unpaved road that passes near the ruins after nightfall have reported the most peculiar phenomena. They speak of a sudden, inexplicable drop in the temperature, a pocket of cold air that materializes even on the most suffocating of summer nights. They claim to smell things that should not be there, phantom aromas that drift out of the dark woods. Most commonly, they report the scent of burnt sugar, a cloying, acrid smell, as if a pot of caramel had been left on the fire too long. Others have smelled rum, not the pleasant aroma of the spirit, but the sharp, pungent smell of it being spilled, wasted. These are the scents of the master's indulgence, the very things his wealth afforded him, now lingering as a spectral stain on the air. The stories passed down through the generations of the families who were once enslaved here are darker, more personal. They are not told to frighten tourists, but to remember, to honor the terrible price of a single act of rebellion. They say that on the anniversary of the feast, if the moon is full and the air is still, you can sometimes see a faint, flickering light through the trees, in the place where the great house once stood. It is not the warm, steady light of a candle, but a swarm of ghostly fireflies, their cold green sparks clustering and hovering in the shape of windows, a spectral echo of the house in its final moments. They speak of sounds, too. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a whip, a sound that carries on the night air with no discernible source. A single, choked cry, quickly silenced. These are not just ghost stories. They are fragments of collective trauma, passed down like heirlooms, a reminder of the violence that was the true foundation of this place. The most persistent and chilling element of the legend, however, is the voice. It is said to belong to Mariah. It is not a scream of anguish, but a whisper, as soft and insidious as the Spanish moss that drips from the cypress trees. It is never heard by large groups, but only by individuals, usually those who have wandered too close to the ruined chimney, or those who are poling their skiffs through the black, mirror-like water of the adjacent swamp. An old trapper, a man named Jean-Pierre, whose grandfather had told him the story, claimed to have heard it once as a young man. He said he had been checking his lines at dusk when he heard what he thought was his wife calling his name. He turned, but there was no one there. Then, the whisper came again, seeming to rise from the water itself, from the very air around him. It was a woman's voice, he said, low and calm, and it carried a simple, 4-word warning. It told him, "Don't taste what you cannot pay for." He said he abandoned his traps and did not return to that part of the bayou for a full year. Such was the profound and unsettling power of that simple phrase. This warning has become the core of Mariah's legend. In the stories, she is not just a specter of vengeance, a restless spirit tied to a place of suffering. She has become something more complex, a guardian, a dark oracle of the swamp. Her spirit, they say, still presides over her kitchen, her presence anchored to the unfallen chimney. The poison she perfected that night did not die with her. It has become a part of the land itself. Certain plants in that area are said to be more potent, their berries darker, their roots more bitter. Local lore says that to eat from the wild fig trees that grow near the ruins is to invite a terrible, wasting sickness. The revenge she enacted, it seems, was not a single, explosive event. It was the planting of a seed of bitterness and retribution that has taken root in the very soil of the place, a curse that never cooled. Did her act of vengeance bring any measure of justice, or did it only unleash a greater cycle of violence, a haunting that continues to this day? The historical record is silent, but the whispers from the swamp offer an answer. They suggest that Mariah's revenge did not truly end that night in 1831. It merely changed its form, becoming as permanent and as patient as the landscape itself, a lingering flavor on the air, a story waiting in the shadows for anyone foolish enough to listen. The record on the deadly revenge of the slave cook is now complete, and your presence through its final, haunting page is a testament to the power of stories that refuse to die. If our journey through the darker corridors of history is one you wish to continue, subscribe to stand with us when the next file is unsealed, and share in the comments what this account has left with you.